Welcome to the Apostolic Ink podcast. Apostolic Ink is the official podcast of Dr. Jason Weatherly. In each episode, Dr. Weatherly addresses the tough theological issues of the 21st century church. No huff, no fluff, just thus, says the Word of God. And now, here's your host, Dr. Weatherly.
Thank you, anonymous radio announcer, and thank you, listening audience, for tuning in to the Apostolic Ink podcast. In this episode, we're going to address the question, does Genesis 1:26 prove the Trinity? And by Trinity, I mean the doctrine that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three separate and distinct persons within the one Godhead. Genesis 1:26 opens with, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Trinitarian scholars and debaters have for decades, if not centuries, affirmed that the fact that the word God in Hebrew, elohim, is plural, and the fact that when God speaks in this passage, he uses the plural pronouns us and our, that this proves the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, as a Oneness Pentecostal, I have heard this passage brought up many times in public debates and discussions. Likewise, I attended a Trinitarian college for my undergrad, and both my Old Testament survey and my Greek professors appealed to Genesis 1:26 as evidence of the Trinity in the Old Testament. Interestingly, not all Trinitarians agree that Genesis 1:26 is proof of the Trinity. David Croto and Gary Yates, in their book Urban Legends of the Old Testament, dedicate an entire chapter on the misconception that the Trinity is directly taught in Genesis 1:26. They state, quote, "In its historical context, Genesis 1:26 through 28 is not teaching the plurality of the Godhead. As Michael Hazer has noted, quote, the triune Godhead idea is never transparently expressed in the Old Testament," end of both quotes. Just as a side note, I personally know Dr. Croto. He serves as a professor and an academic dean of Columbia Biblical Seminary, which is where I earned my PhD. So let's examine Genesis 1:26 and determine whether or not this passage is indeed a proof text for the Trinity. First, let's look at the Hebrew word for God, elohim. Yes, the word elohim in Hebrew is plural. Hebrew, like many non-English languages, utilizes distinct spellings for plural words. And we do this occasionally with some words in English, like the plural words people and mice, but for the most, we just slap an S or an ES at the end of a noun to make it plural. But the fact that God, elohim, in Hebrew is plural does not prove or even infer that God is a Trinity. The Hebrew language is not as rigid on plurals and singulars as we try to make the English language. In fact, English is not as rigid on singulars and plurals as we would like to think. I mean, when was the last time you bought a fruit basket? Was there only just one piece of fruit in that basket? Or are we using the singular fruit in a plural sense? In the Old Testament, there are several Hebrew words that only occur in a plural form, but oftentimes retain a singular context. For example, the very opening of the Bible, Genesis 1:1 states, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." The word heaven in Hebrew is hashamayim, and it only occurs in the plural form. Yet the King James Version translates it as the singular heaven. Now, most contemporary English Bibles, such as the New King James Version, renders hashamayim as a plural heavens to differentiate the sky or the universe from the dwelling place of God's throne. There is no singular word for heaven in the Old Testament. Context dictates whether it's talking about the heavens, the sky, the universe, or heaven, the place of God's throne. Then in Genesis 1:2, the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters. The word face in Hebrew is panim, which is a plural word, and it only occurs in the plural form in the Old Testament. Notice that it's translated in the singular as face or surface. In Hebrew, if you talk about a person's face, it is the plural panim. There is no singular word for face. So whether you're talking about one face or 1,000 faces, it is still the Hebrew plural panim. The word water in Hebrew, mayim, is also a plural word that only occurs in the plural in the Old Testament. And it can be translated either as a plural, as in the New King James Version, or as a singular, as in the New English translation. So again, the Hebrew language is not as rigid on singular and plurals, and there are many other instances of Hebrew plural words used in a singular sense. Likewise, the Hebrew plural elohim, or God, is also used in several contexts where it can only be taken as a singular. For example, in Genesis 23:6, Abraham is called Elohim, yet Abraham was obviously only one person. In Exodus 7:1, Yahweh says to Moses, "You will be a God, an Elohim, to Pharaoh." And again, Moses was obviously only one person. In Exodus 32:1-4, the plural elohim describes the golden calf, yet there was only one singular golden calf. And it's not like the plural elohim is the only Hebrew word for God. There are several singular Hebrew words for God throughout the Old Testament. For example, the word El in Genesis 14:18, Melchizedek, priest of the Most High God, or El. El occurs 250 times in the Old Testament. There's also Eloah, which is used 52 times in the Old Testament. There's the singular Aramaic Elah, which is used 80 times. And then there's the third person singular name Yahweh, which is found over 6,500 times in the Old Testament. So even though Elohim may be plural in form, all sorts of singular nouns are used in connection with Elohim, not to mention that the verbs associated with Elohim are typically singular. So if there are all these other singular words for God, why would the Old Testament ever use the plural Elohim for God? Well, that all goes back to the Hebrew language in Hebrew grammar, where Hebrew uses plurals and repetition to indicate a superlative. Hebrew doesn't have good, better, best. It says good, good, good. So if you want to indicate that something is the best, you say it is good, good, good. If you want to indicate that something is like the best placed, you would say it is the good of goods. You use either repetition or plurals. So when the seraphim want to declare that Yahweh is the most high or the most holy, they cry, holy, holy, holy. If you want to describe a song as the best song ever, you would say that it is the song of songs. So the plural Elohim does not refer to a plurality of persons, rather it denotes a plural of majesty, the sum of all power displayed in the one true God. Now let's get back to Genesis 1:26. There are three possible explanations as to why God used the plurals, "let us make man in our image and after our likeness." So let's consider the first explanation, that God is a Trinity. Well, on the outset from this verse alone, the concept of the Trinity doesn't work because the plurals us and our are used with the singular verb said, which actually describes the real action of the verse. The verb said in this passage is singular. And when the plural Elohim, or God, is coupled with a singular verb or adjective, the plural noun is a majestic plural, not a numerical plural. Also, when you look at the next verse, Genesis 1:27, we see that when the actual action took place, singular verbs were used. So God created, that singular, man in his own image. In the image of God, created, again, a singular verb, created he, him. Male and female created he, them. Adam was created in the image and likeness of Elohim, or God. If Elohim, God, is a Trinity, then Adam, being in the image and likeness of a Trinity, should have been triplets. Now, someone may say, but Adam was body, soul, and spirit, and that's three. That's right, that is three. but that's not three persons. You can say the body is separate and distinct from the soul all day long, and I'll agree with you. But you cannot say that they are so radically distinct that they are two separate persons. No, body, soul, and spirit is still one person. Just as much as the Father is not the Son, and I'll agree with you, but the Father is not so radically separated from the Son to be a different person in the Godhead. Also, in other Old Testament passages which describe creation, such as Isaiah 44:24, Yahweh declares that he stretched out the heavens alone and spread abroad the earth by myself. So the Trinity explanation just won't work. And again, there are contemporary Trinitarian scholars who agree that Genesis 1:26 does not prove the Trinity. Another explanation is that God was talking to the angels, or what commentators refer to as the heavenly court. So if you hear or read someone mention the heavenly court, don't freak out. This is just some theological language for the angels in heaven. So this explanation is what is given by the Jews and has been given by the Jews for centuries, and the Jews are absolute monotheistic. As proof that God was talking to the angels, they point to Job 38:7 that the angels were present during creation, and that there are a couple of other passages where God used the plural us, such as man has become as one of us, knowing good and evil in Genesis 3:22, in which the context indicates that God was talking to the angels. Also, Jewish scholars point out that when angels appear on the earth, the scriptures indicate that they look like men. Now, honestly, I think this is a very good explanation of the passage, and I think this explanation can silence a Trinitarian argument, and it is a simple explanation for the average churchgoer to give. However, I do not believe that this is the full explanation of the passage. The reason why is because in the other passages, when God is talking to the angels, whatever the plural pronouns are referring to, such as man has become as one of us, knowing good and evil, the angels share in whatever is mentioned in the passage. In other words, in that passage, the angels know the difference between good and evil. However, in Genesis 1:26 through 27, even though God said, "Let us make man in our own image," verse 27 makes it very clear that only God created man. So the angels may have been present, they may have watched, they may have shouted, but they did not share in that which the plural pronouns modify. The third explanation, which is what I affirm, is that the statement, "Let us make man in our own image after our own likeness," is an example of what grammarians call the epistolary plural, or the editorial we. The editorial we is simply the use of the first person plural by an author when he is in reality referring only to himself. We do this all the time when we are simply talking about ourselves or to ourselves. I've done this several times already in this podcast. And this is also the explanation for a passage such as Genesis 11:7, where God said, "Let us go down and confuse the language." God was simply talking about and to himself. The use of the editorial we is found all throughout the Bible, especially in Paul's writings. But here are just a handful of examples from both the Old and New Testaments. In Daniel 2:36, Daniel tells the king, "This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof." When Daniel said "we," he was referring only to himself. In Mark 15:32, it says, "And they that were crucified with him reviled him." But in Luke 23:39, it states that it was one of the malefactors that railed on him. The plural pronoun they actually referring back to the singular one of the malefactors. And then in John 3:11, when Jesus told Nicodemus, "We speak that we know and testify that we have seen, and you receive our witness, Even Trinitarian scholars such as A.T. Robertson declared that the plural pronouns here are an example of the editorial we. So in Genesis 1:26, when God said, "Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness," God was simply talking to himself. Or as Paul says in Ephesians 1:11, God was working all things after the counsel of his own will. Even Trinitarians acknowledge that the plural pronouns in Genesis 1:26 do not necessitate a plurality of persons, but denote the editorial we. In the United Bible Society's Translator's Guide on the book of Genesis, Heber Peacock states on Genesis 1:26, quote, "Since the word God is plural in Hebrew, the plural pronoun forms may also mean that God is, so to speak, conferring with himself. Some translations take the plurals as only referring to God and translate them, I will make, be like me and resemble me." End of quote. In closing, I want to address one more thing. I have heard some of our Oneness Pentecostal brethren overcomplicate Genesis 1:26. Over the past 35 years of living for the Lord, I've heard several Oneness preachers explain Genesis 1:26 like this. Since God did not have a form or image in the Old Testament, God was speaking proleptically to the incarnation, the image of the invisible God, in the New Testament. And as such, God, the invisible Spirit in the Old Testament, spoke to the incarnation, God manifested in flesh, in the New Testament, saying, "Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness." So in essence, you still have God counseling with his own will. You don't have to overcomplicate it by making this some proleptical statement. Now, I'm not sure if they're just trying to sound academic or they are just trying to have some deep theology, but it's not needed because you're coming to the same conclusion as simply explaining the passage as the editorial we. Besides that, I would reject the idea that God did not have an image or form in the Old Testament because Yahweh clearly states in Numbers 12:6-8 that when he spoke to other prophets, he made himself known in visions and dreams, but not so with Moses. With Moses, Yahweh spoke face to face, for Moses sees the form of the Lord. So Yahweh was not some formless God in the Old Testament who had to look proleptically to the incarnation. No, Genesis 1:26 is an example of the editorial we. Genesis 1:26 does not prove the Trinity, and God was not talking to the angels. God was simply talking about himself and to himself, working all things after the counsel of his own will. Ephesians 1:11. I'm Dr. Weatherly, and this is the Apostolic Ink podcast.